Good morning and welcome everyone to panel 6 of the Dominican Studies Association 2020 conference. Entitled Language and the Construction of Dominicanidades Across Geographic Space, the research presented in this panel provides insight into how language shapes our ideas about identity in the Dominican Republic and across the diaspora. In Tamo Harto, Molly Ham Rodriguez considers language as social action to describe how particular linguistic styles have strategically deployed to index collective solidarity and mobilize mass protest in relation to the 2020 Dominican presidential election. In New Blacks, Aris Moreno Clemons explores the tensions between the racial constructions of the United States and the Dominican Republic by analyzing assertions of ethno-racial belonging among Dominicans on social media platforms. And in Some Type of Spanish, Amber Teresa Domingue examines the connections between race, language, and racialization as women in a Dominican hair salon in Atlanta, Georgia, navigate social constructions of Blackness as distinct from a Dominican identity. Yasmine Irisari will offer analysis and synthesis of the panel, and we'll end with open discussion, inviting participants to pose questions and comments by unmuting themselves or by posting to chat. I have the honor of moderating, I have the honor of moderating the session and introducing each presenter. I'm Almeida Jacqueline Toribio. I'm a native Dominican fronteriza and professor of linguistics in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin, where I hold affiliations in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies and the Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies. And I also serve as faculty director of the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program. A large part of my scholarship centers on language and ethnic identity with reference to US Latinx and transnational Afro-Hispanic populations. Before proceeding to introduce our first presenter, I'd like to thank the program committee for having facilitated this impressive virtual encounter for Dominicans and allies, and to offer a special word of gratitude to Luana Ferreira for having encouraged us to prepare a panel devoted to language. Now on to our first speaker. Our first presenter, Molly, do you want to start sharing your material? Yeah. Okay. Our first presenter, Molly Ham Rodriguez, is a doctoral candidate in the Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy program in the School of Education at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She has completed graduate certificates in linguistics as well as in ethnic studies. Molly was recently awarded a Fulbright Hays to complete 9 months of ethnographic research in the Dominican Republic for her dissertation study, which will explore how youth language and literacy development are ideologically framed by state and multilateral actors in historical and ongoing projects of modernization, and also how youth perspectives on their own practices provide alternative framings of multilingualism and multiliteracies. She's been involved in educational practice and research in the Dominican Republic since 2011 and has co-authored 2 book chapters overviewing the country's education system. I leave you with Molly Ham Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I apologize, I'm moving back and forth between 2 screens. So you all know how the new Zoom life is. I really feel honored to participate in this panel. And I'm looking forward to our collective presentation, our discussion at the end about language and social identity. And my presentation today focuses on understanding language as social action and the use of linguistic style for purposes of social differentiation by examining the series of protests that began in the Dominican Republic in February of 2020 around the presidential elections. Why a focus on the protests and what's in a protest sign? I want to start by talking a bit about the theory of language I use in this presentation. Linguistic anthropological perspectives have emphasized the role of language as a resource that's available to achieve particular social actions. And this perspective is grounded in the idea that both linguistic practices and social contexts are mutually constitutive of one another. So in other words, we can learn something about our social and cultural worlds by paying attention to language, and to know something about language, we have to pay attention to the context in which speech and discourse are embedded. And the spoken and written word are powerful resources through which identities are enacted, social critiques are developed, and interactional work is accomplished. Language also works in combination with other semiotic resources that allow meaning making to occur in particular contexts. So in this cartoon, we can see that the words on the protest sign, Dios, Patria, Libertad, a phrase that appears on the Dominican flag, serves a specific communicative purpose in the protests, as these protests were positioned in the service of national democratic elections. Yet in the context of this cartoon, it also provides a social commentary on the repression that protesters faced by government officials and police, including instances where protest signs were torn in half, protesters with signs were blocked from boarding the metro, and the presence of a folded protest sign could arouse state-sanctioned suspicion. So here the materiality of the poster itself, even without language visible, serves as a powerful sign that's perceived by some as a public threat and by others as a seed of social transformation. Specifically, the social critiques that are embedded in the language of protest signs and the co-occurrence of language with other semiotic practices of protest and the public visibility of protests cause the mere presence of anything that looked like a protest sign to index a particular stance in relation to the government. And I also wanted to point out quickly here the t-shirt of the protester holding the sign in the cartoon, which features an outline of the country and a hashtag symbol, which together point to the role of social media in organizing both physical and digital protests. The issues raised by the cartoon are central to my research question for this project. Specifically, I sought to explore how language was used in social protest, what social actions and identities were foregrounded by those uses of language and which were erased. And to answer this question, I engaged in digital ethnographic research through Instagram. And I just wanted to point out that it's not a study of the digital platform itself, but rather it's a study that uses technology as the medium to understand larger social issues connected to everyday life. And scholars of social movements in Latin America have frequently explored how the intimacies of social media and public plazas have been central to mobilizations that are flexible and dispersed. And in addition, hashtags have been found to be productive sites for exploring the semiotics of digital protest as being both connected to and distinct from their physical geographies. And during the protests in the Dominican Republic, social media in general, and Instagram in particular, was a site where protest signs from numerous geographies within and beyond the country were shared. In addition, calls for mobilizing, displays of solidarity, updates on events, social critiques were regularly shared and reshared through stories and posts, reaching publics far beyond La Plaza de la Bandera. And my interest in this topic simply emerged from my own authentic engagement with social media during the protests. My questions emerged over time and over a series of events, partially in relationship to the ways I closely followed the protests in Puerto Rico through the summer of 2019. And so here I'm just showing an example of some hashtags and Instagram accounts that I followed for information and updates throughout the protests. I've just focused here on those that specifically emerged in relation to the protests or that became a central source of communication and mobilizing through the protests and the pandemic. But this does not include the many other public accounts as well as friends and family in the Dominican Republic who I'd already been following at the time the protests began and where I also got information. But it is a representative sample of the types of resources that were available for following stories as they unfolded. So in the next two slides, I wanted to share a bit more about my theoretical framing. In examining social protest signs, memes, and other circulating texts, I paid particular attention to linguistic style. And according to linguistic anthropologist Judith Irvine, style is about distinctiveness. Stylistic choices are always situated within a social framework of meanings that contrast with other possible styles and other possible meanings. So thinking about linguistic style is helpful to understand how particular linguistic features are selected, in other words, how they're spoken or how they're written in specific social settings to index certain social identities. And so the approach that I'm using is in contrast to, more variationist approaches that might be concerned with understanding how particular language features correlate with specific variables such as socioeconomic class or gender. I'm really interested in thinking about the process of distinction itself. Therefore, I ask throughout this project what processes of social differentiation are embedded in particular ways of speaking or in representing that speech through the written word. In the case of this protest sign, I consider the social meanings that were embedded in the written representation of the words para, pantalones y puestos. I thought about how the authors of these signs use apostrophes to signal the elision of final syllables to the consonant S in different locations, and what social identities the author might be indexing by making and marking these decisions. And in the context of public protests, they also reflected on the decisions that protesters made to use written speech to represent certain patterns of oral speech, and how those decisions were linked to communicative purposes in relation to the sign's intended audience and its message. And it's important to point out in this conversation that style is always a creative process. It's not socially deterministic. So of course, we wouldn't expect all Dominican protesters to use the same linguistic features in protest, or that the use of the same features would signal the same political goals. Yet the value of studying linguistic style is that there is always some level of coherence to the ways that particular features are used in relation to social identities, events, or communicative purposes. And that's really what's of interest to me in this project. And so here I want to connect ideas about linguistic style to identity, which is the topic of our panel today. And sociolinguistics, such as Jeremy Calder, have illustrated that there's not a one-to-one or fixed relationship between linguistic features and meanings, the meanings of particular linguistic features, and who is doing the interpreting of those features, and the bodies that are producing those linguistic features create different interpretations. And so as I think about linguistic style and how certain linguistic features might reoccur on protest signs, I'm doing so in relation to the specific sociopolitical and communicative context of these protests. And so it means that, you know, the findings that I'm presenting, the same features could be used differently by individuals in different contexts in order to index different types of social meetings or perform different kinds of identities. I also wanted to emphasize the role of ideology in stylistic practice, which has been studied by Penny Eckert and others. And Penny Eckert talks about how by producing particular styles, we're positioning ourselves in respect to the world, and that this positioning is not just a representation of the self, but it's also a positioning in relation to available social categories or figures of personhood. And it's also linked to larger processes such as political economy or systems of power. And so when we notice a style, we're also noticing the group or individual associated with that style. And these noticings mutually reinforce one another. And in these cases, both the linguistic form and the context of the utterance are important for meaning making to occur. And finally, in my analysis, I use Mary Buckles and Kira Hall's sociocultural theorization of identity as being produced in interaction through language and other semiotic practices. As Buckles and Hall describe, identities are constructed relationally, and they can shed light on the relationship between self and other, and the construction of boundaries of similarity and difference. So in this slide, I consider how linguistic style was used in the public protest for the purpose of social differentiation. And I just wanted to note that I only focus on the signs themselves and have cut out you know, people's faces, as I don't have permission to circulate people's images. So I just have focused on the signs themselves. And one of the major findings from this ethnographic study is that the use of particular linguistic features often associated with Dominican Spanish bilinguists, such as the elision of final consonants or final S or the intervocalic D, these features frequently co-occurred in protest signs where individuals were engaged in discursive processes of social differentiation to index the collective identity of el pueblo on the one hand, and then to refer to governing elites on the other. And we can understand this linguistic process as iconization, when the language features used are seen to be iconic of Dominican identity, and the use of this linguistic style in written form combines with other identity markers, such as the Dominican flag or cultural references, in protests to index a collective and undifferentiated Dominican identity. And so by examining these signs here, we can see where the collective we is invoked in relation to the them of the government, which is positioned as corrupt. In addition, the plural third person is often invoked without a specific referent, but from context, we know the implied actor is the government. For example, the government is quien les roben. The government is se fuen. That's one of my favorites. The contrasts here are important in the process of differentiation. Interactionally, in the context of the social protests, these linguistic features that are selected to index a popular Dominican identity are to be interpreted as collectively, as collective exploitation by the government. And then this collective identity is specifically used to create distance from and opposition to the elite class, which is positioned as wealthy, and of course, extractive. But creating this collective Dominican identity using the concept of el pueblo requires a strategy of intersubjective identity production that Buckles and Hall call adequation. In contrast to differentiation, which I talked a little bit about in the last slide, adequation requires that groups or individuals be positioned as alike for interactional purposes, regardless of actual differences. So in this case, all other axes of differentiation, such as class, gender, racialization, ethnicity, language, or migration status are subsumed within the category of el pueblo. El pueblo comes to stand in for el país with the intent to invoke a unified population where everyone would equally benefit or win, as the sign there says, from the results of the election. And social class, which maps onto differences in racialization, was consistently foregrounded as a marker of differentiation that was irrelevant, right? Protest science said that this was irrelevant as a motivational force for social protests. And in this example, I wanted to point out that the linguistic styles used are not as salient as in the process of differentiation. But this analysis allows us to recognize the discursive strategy of adequation because it was necessary for other axes of differentiation, such as pueblo versus gobierno, to exist and to be perceived as effective and persuasive. Judith Irvine and Susan Gall have theorized how this process of iconization, or the ways that particular linguistic features become iconic of a specific social group or identity, always results in the erasure of particular aspects of variation, whether that be in language, social identity, or other silences. So if the linguistic styles seen across many protest signs have become iconic of Dominican Spanish and are being used to index a collective identity of el pueblo, differences are also being erased in this process. So in the previous slide, as we discussed the erasure of differences in social class, here I shared two examples from the protests which provided counter narratives to the discourse of a collective unified identity, where all supposedly are affected and stand to benefit from government decisions in the same ways. Both examples here functioned through the implicit and explicit affirmation of Blackness. In the first example, activist Ana Belique and the organization Reconocidos' participation in protests critique the idea that there's a shared notion of democracy in the country. They point to La Sentencia, which retroactively denationalized Dominicans of Haitian descent, noting that the passage of this law was also an affront to democracy, yet implying that there's not been the same level of outrage on behalf of those affected by the law. And this protest sign and the physical bodies of the protesters holding the sign disrupted notions of a unified pueblo with shared interests or shared experiences of oppression and exploitation in relation to the government, but also in relation to each other. And this intervention also critiques normative conceptions of citizenship by pointing to voting as something denied by the government to a significant portion of the population. And in the second example, the decolonial feminist activist collective Junta de Prietas also made a discursive and semiotic intervention into the dominant narrative of the protests. In an excerpt from an Instagram post, the group invokes a specific we, anti-racist activists, who are called on to show up to protests in white t-shirts rather than the black t-shirts that had been used so far by protesters in La Plaza de la Bandera. In this semiotic act, they specifically call out whiteness and its manifestations in the government and elite class as the opposing they against which protests should be aimed, while invoking the we of the majority Black and Afro-descendant population that has long been exploited. And in reclaiming discursive and semiotic space, both activist groups contest the erasure of specific identities and social conditions on which much of the collective organizing narratives depended. So finally, to close, I simply wanted to note that I have been inspired by scholars such as Dr. Toribio, who have long explored language variation and Dominican identity in a variety of contexts. And I really look forward to hearing the other panelists' perspectives on language and social identity as well. As somebody who studies bilingualism and bilingual education, I'm fascinated by how we can help students understand the ideological nature of language and the ways that linguistic variation and social identity are in dynamic relation with one another and always context dependent. So really my goal with this presentation was to provide one example of how we can contextually analyze language in a way that can help us think about the relationships between language and political goals and understand both what is gained and what is lost through the use of certain discursive strategies. And thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly, for that presentation. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions during the discussion period for you. Our second presenter, Aris Moreno Clemons, is in her final year of the PhD program in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. She also holds a portfolio in Mexican American and Latina studies. Originally from San Francisco, she was trained in anti-racist activist perspectives. She brings this training to her research, which critically examines how emergent ethno-racial categories are created and concretized in public discourse. Her dissertation, entitled Spanish People Be Like, Dominican Ethno-Racio-Linguistic Stance-Taking and the Construction of Afro-Latinidad in the US, is a critical discourse analysis of Dominicanidades in online spaces. She's crafted a truly interdisciplinary project using linguistic methodologies to collect and present data that is then interpreted through theoretical lenses developed in ethnic and cultural studies, anthropology, education, and sociology. In so doing, her research reveals aspects of racial formation that are rarely considered. I leave you with Aris.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Toribio, and thank you, Molly, for that great presentation. It's wonderful to follow you. So today, my talk is entitled New Blacks, Language, DNA, and the Construction of the African-American Dominican Boundary of Difference. And in it, I focus on the ways that notions of Blackness are talked about, acquired, or contested across ethnic groups who engage in social media discourse. So though this paper talks a lot about ideologies, language practices, and ethno-racial belonging, today I'm going to contain my talk to just a discussion of two racial-linguistic ideologies and the moments that the acquisition or the contestation of these ideologies provides a space for either interethnic solidarity or conflict. So before getting into the current study, I want to briefly speak about myself because I believe it's important to be transparent about where I'm coming from in terms of how I arrived to this research. So I think that this gives credence to my choices about my research frames, my questions, and ultimately my interpretations. So as was previously mentioned, I'm from the Bay Area in California, and I spent much of my formative years watching my grandmother and her activist colleagues fight for the right of and defend the right of African-American language. So this defense of African-American language would lead up to the Oakland Ebonics debates of the 1990s. And we can think about it when we're thinking about bilingualism and the debates for an entry into home language into school spaces. So I went to an African Montessori school for preschool, and instruction happened there in English, French, and Swahili. My father's African American and my mother was born in Martinique. So I was raised around this kind of Black diaspora consisting of African Americans, West Indians, and African migrants. So these Black coalitions around which I was formed grounded me in my passion for language diversity, but also in my passion for Black liberatory struggles. So that brings me into my entry into Dominicanidad. So at 19, I moved to Spain. And when I moved there, I was often re-ethnicized as Dominican. And so I began to interact with more and more Dominicans. Having grown up in the Bay Area, we didn't have a large population of Dominicans. So as I began to interact with more Dominicans, I noticed a lot of cultural similarities between Dominican cultural practices and those of my West Indian family. And I had grown up in this enclave where heritage from any West Indian island made you automatic family. So I began to question the separation of what amounted to like Anglo, Dutch, and French Caribbean from Spanish Caribbean, or what amounted to West Indianness from Latinidad. So this question has driven much of my research. And of course, now that I'm armed with a lot more historical, anthropological, linguistic knowledge, my goal is to demystify this separation. So in this current study, I'm exploring several moments of discursive conflicts and solidarities and the role that language plays in mapping the margins of identity for Dominican Americans in the United States. So these conflicts often play out in the public sphere, which we see in the following example. So on June 25th, 2019, Belcalis Almensad, better known as Cardi B, took to Instagram Live in order to defend her Blackness. Her aim was to clarify confusion about her ethno-racial identity following a wave of criticism resulting from her BET Album of the Year and Best Female Hip Hop Artist Awards. So people argued that she should not be eligible for the award because, quote, she is not Black, end quote. They claim that her use of Spanish language and her previous claims of Latinidad precluded her from Blackness. So this policing of Blackness is not new. However, increased migrations from Latin America and the Caribbean over the last 50 years has complicated and enriched the sociocultural landscapes of the United States. So in her response, Cardi B attempts to dispel this myth of a mutual exclusivity between Blackness and Latinidad by saying, quote, people don't be understanding blank. It's like Cardi B's Latin, she's not Black. And it's like, bro, My features do not come from white people effing, okay? But because Cardi B speaks Spanish to people, she's not Black, even though we have similar features, same skin complexion, but no, they don't want to put Cardi in because I speak Spanish, end quote. So she then goes on to explain that the problem is a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. She attributes this ignorance to a lack of proper education in the United States, but in attributing it to education, she arrives at kind of the core matter regarding public discussions on race in the United States. And that's first, as a society, we have not yet agreed upon a set definition of terms of identity that we use in everyday conversation. Second, part of the reason that we have not agreed is because there are societal institutions that either willfully obscure our understandings, or at the very least, they have done little to historicize the rise of these notions. So several videos and other social media responses popped up to weigh in on the debate of whether Cardi B could authentically claim Blackness. And further, they weighed in on that a correct answer existed and it was necessary in order to validate her status within Black entertainment. So topics such as color, physical features, hair texture and nose size, familial ancestry, neighborhood, and former enslavement in the United States all entered into the conversation. But what was clear from all of these responses is that there was a wide-ranging and disparate notions and opinions from Dominicans and non-Dominicans alike about what it means to be Black in the United States today. So notions of Dominicanidad in the United States are being structured by debates about who actually gets to claim Blackness in this country. I argue that in order to contend with this question, it's important to recognize both the commonalities and the differences between race constructions across the Americas. So a hemispheric understanding of race construction needs to be had. So for hundreds of years in the United States, we functioned on this racialized dichotomy of Black and white, which is characterized by what is popularly known as the one-drop rule of hypodescent. So this means that anybody with one drop of African blood is cast into the category of Black. In marked contraposition, in the Dominican Republic, one drop of European blood can cast one out of the racial categorization of Black and into a conceptualization of mixed. So this creates a kind of tripartite conceptualization of race in which Black, white, and mixed coexist. So this is often framed under notions of mestizaje or mulatez. And herein, I'm investigating the public stances of Black as an identity category for Dominican Americans, because it is a group with a representative population of individuals who are marked as Black in the United States, despite some of them holding particular ideologies and explicit pronouncements to the contrary, right? So I formulate, let's see if this lets me switch, yeah. I formulate my investigation with two guiding questions. So I first ask what ideologies, what linguistic ideologies are implicated in the construction of Blackness for Dominicans and Dominican Americans in the United States. And then I ask what mechanisms are used to create what I call the African American Dominican boundary of difference. I took a phenomenological approach to answering my question. So after selecting and transcribing 10 YouTube videos, I applied codes for 4 racial-linguistic ideologies that have been discussed in previous literature or that were developed in the course of my research. I also applied these codes to 50 comments and saw how they were taken up in discussions that followed the videos and followed the comments. And I can talk about those more a bit later, just to save time. So the 4 ideologies investigated were the DNA ideology, which posits race as a biological construct that can be accounted for by DNA and attested by heritage linked to a particular landmass. The category ideology, which is the conflation of ethnicity, nationality, and race that's identified by a particular pan-ethnic term, such as Black for African Americans only. The co-naturalization of language and race, which is the conflation of language and race as a named category of belonging, as in when we say Spanish food or Spanish people in New York, and we're not referring to people from Spain. And lastly, the accent ideology, which is racial belonging based on the ability to produce unaccented language. So that would be unaccented Spanish for Latinidad and unaccented English for Blackness. So I examined 10 videos with titles related to Dominicans and Blackness, and each was between 10 and 20 minutes for a total of 128 minutes of video content. The videos were produced by Dominicans and other Black diaspora content producers, Nigerian Americans, Cuban Americans, and Panamanian Americans. And the videos range from outright conflict with African Americans and Haitians in many cases to outright support for African Americans and the construction of the Black diaspora. So how did the data manifest? So across the entire data set, there was a total of 933 excerpts, which yielded 925 instances of the focal racial linguistic ideologies that I identified earlier. So DNA ideology was the most prevalent with 535 appearances, and this was closely followed by the categorization fallacy or the categorization ideology that had 372 instances. So overall, this data was suggesting that people are still heavily dedicated to negotiating and discussing both scientific race and the modern conceptions of the nation state and identity. Language, on the other hand, took a back seat in conversations about race, with the co-naturalization of language and race only presenting 16 tokens and accent ideology only producing 2. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to give examples of how this race was taken up discursively in the 2 most prominent ideologies, but I welcome questions about these other ideologies because language does play a part in even the construction of the DNA and the categorization fallacy. So we can talk about that later. So the DNA ideology was most prevalent, and we see it used to evidence these differing racial constructs that I was talking about. So hypodescent, represented in the first comment, is where anyone with African ancestry is automatically categorized as Black. So it reads, quote, "When was the last time you did a DNA analysis? If no sub-Saharan DNA shows up, I'll personally call you a white person, okay?" End quote. This is clearly evidencing an adherence to this one-drop rule. The second comment, which represents notions of mestizaje, reads, "I'm only 10% African. That doesn't make me only African. Some people are delusional to think Dominicans are only Black," end quote. These comments imply a linkage to African as the most valid indicator of Blackness. Here, the conflict lies in how genetics determine where these boundaries lie. So there were also multiple moments of conflict brought about by the conflation of race, ethnicity, and nationality. Here we see explicit mention of this ideology in the excerpt, which reads, "You are right about things you say here, brother. But when they say, 'I'm not Black, I'm Dominican,' it's when Dominicans are speaking about African Americans. They are called Black in the United States." Here we see that Black is not a pan-racial term, but rather an ethnic term that's used only for African Americans. Nonetheless, these ideologies did not always appear in conflict, and oftentimes they appeared more with comments of solidarity. So many people evoke DNA and African ancestry as a mode of community building and of solidarity. In this comment from an Afro-Boricua in response to a solidarity video posted by an Afro-Dominicana, we see the evocation of Africa as a means of unification. The quote reads, "Wow, oh my God, I'm a Black Boricua and I love your video. Say it, sister. Mother Africa is in every Dominican. Los Dominicanos son negros como yo," end quote. Lastly, we see the categorization ideology as a way to introduce the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So in this one, the commenter is trying to get the interlocutor to understand that Dominicans can share racial categories with many other nationalities. So it reads, "I don't think you get the point. Dominican is a nationality. If you say you want a Black girl, how do I know if you want a Jamaican, Trinidadian, Bahamas, Haitian? If she's darker complected, then she's Afro-Latino race-wise. If you try to make a point with Black and Dominican, then you have generalized with different types of Black women." So this person is trying to say, actually, we can be Black. The problem is that there's a difference between race and nationality, race, ethnicity, and nationality. So fundamentally, the construction of Blackness is being taken up semiotically in these conversations. But the debate about Blackness in these forums often called on colonial logics of scientific race and reproduced structures of white supremacy. So while discourses on genetic race dominated conversation, terminology mattered. So it seemed that people were actively engaged in the negotiation of identity terms. And in these negotiations, they were bringing with them structures of knowledge that were already existent in the dominant society. So these knowledges often reified the boundaries that strengthened already established racial hierarchies. So they were already bringing with them these colonial logics within the conversations and negotiations of racial terms. So for immigrants and their immediate descendants in the United States, competing narratives included active promotions of the one-drop rule, first versus the introduction of mixed through the promotion of mulates as a racial category into the US schema of race. Additionally, the use of pan-racial term as mono-ethnic identifiers, as is the case with Black for African American, or in many cases in the data negro for Haitiano, is taken up as in this categorization ideology. I look at this data from an anti-racist stance. And when I look at it, I always come to the question of social justice and liberation. So I ask, what happens when you fight to make visible the heterogeneity of African descended people, and thus the liberation of these people, without disrupting the colonial logics under which we were socialized? So it seems to me that without centering decoloniality in your construction of self and others, we're ultimately reproducing these colonial logics, such as genetic race. So these logics may manifest differently based on the terminology and language given to these structures. However, the results are the same, and that's erasure and the reconstitution and reconstruction of these boundaries of difference. So thank you so much for your time. And I want to give a quick special shout out to my former students from Brooklyn and the Bronx, because they're always willing to engage me in conversations about Dominicanidad, about language, and about diasporic solidarities. And I look forward to continuing our discussion in the question and answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aris. That was wonderful. Our third presenter, Amber Teresa Domingue, is a doctoral student in the Anthropology department at the University of South Carolina. She completed a certificate in Women's and Gender Studies and a master's thesis entitled "Tú no eres fácil, Styling Black Hair and Language in a Dominican Beauty Salon." Specializing in linguistic anthropology, Amber seeks to complicate the shared histories of women across the African and Latinx diasporas living in the US South. Amber was recently awarded the Southern Regional Education Board's State Doctoral Scholar Fellowship to aid in the completion of her doctoral program and to support her career path to becoming a professor. Most recently, her research project investigating the healthcare needs of Latinx individuals in South Carolina was funded by the NSF's Research Experience for Graduates grant. Congratulations, Amber, and I leave you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Molly and Aris, for your wonderful presentations. You'll all see a lot of overlap between the analysis that Aris and I do, so I'm always appreciative of her insights. Okay. While previous scholarship in sociolinguistics has focused on defining and complicating Black English, I approach language in the Black community to also include Spanish speakers. There are conflicting discourses surrounding who speaks Spanish and who is considered Black that often do not consider the heterogeneity of experiences in each of these groups and the ways these groups overlap because of shared historical experiences. Research across genres, including linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics, legal studies, and women's studies, have considered the role oppression plays in limiting the Black community. I expand upon these notions to consider Black women's behavior in spaces of empowerment. I join other linguistic anthropologists in challenging studies of Blackness that have traditionally only focused on Black men and challenging studies of women that have traditionally only focused on white women. Blackness is complex, heterogeneous, and diverse. However, in US hegemonic discourses, it is often simplified, homogenized, and made static as a racial category. This talk considers the nuances of Black womanhood and the ways in which differing ideologies about language, race, and identity are in tension within a Dominican hair salon located in the Southern United States. And so to begin my analysis, I consider who is Black and where are they considered Black, right? So as Aris talked about, these are context-dependent identity categories. And to begin, I'll state by saying that I identify as a Black woman. Like many other Black people in the US, I am unaware of my ancestry beyond identifying as Black and being from New Orleans, though the racial history in New Orleans is complicated, which I explore in other work. And so I begin by saying that studies of racialization have focused on phenotypic characteristics, especially skin color. But I also explore the semiotics of hair following the work of Kimberly Simmons in other work that I do. Here, however, I'm focusing on how language and linguistic ability function as a part of the process of racialization. I consider the ways in which racial identity is not static and can change depending on place and the ideologies drawn upon during racialization. So not just thinking about the current physical location of an individual, but the history and the trajectories of places that people have belonged to. And so in this process, I consider how ideological constructions of Blackness are context dependent, as well as thinking about Blackness as going beyond geopolitical boundaries. So I explore the ways in which definitions of Blackness may evolve depending on any number of factors, including age, ethnicity, time in the US, as well as many other things. And so what we'll see then is that racialization is essentially a co-production of meaning through self-identity and identification of the self through others. And so I won't spend too much time talking about the ideologies of hypodescent and mestizaje because Aris did such a great introduction of that in her presentation, but I'll briefly review and say that notions of hypodescent and the one-drop rule in the US define Blackness, define a Black identity as anyone with one drop of Black blood. And this rule has been implemented as a way to historically limit access that Black people would have to resources in a US context, right? So it serves under these sorts of colonial powers that Aris mentioned. And then whereas in the Dominican Republic, Blackness is defined under an ideology of mestizaje, in which the national identity is understood as having aspects of African ancestry, aspects of Spanish ancestry, and aspects of indigenous ancestry. So in someone identifying as being only Black would be exceptional to this rule of mestizaje, in which everyone has a bit of Blackness, but that bit of Blackness wouldn't lead necessarily to a Black identity, which is different from the ideologies in the US. And so I consider my data under a framework of sounding like a race, in which we locate certain racial identities dependent on these contexts, but also on the ways in which linguistic ability is interpreted, and how certain linguistic abilities are mapped onto certain racial identities. So what we'll see is even within a US Black community, because there are different constructions of Blackness, because people have complex migratory histories, there are diverse experiences of Blackness. And we'll also see that a connection between mestizaje and the Spanish language use, so that those who speak Spanish are therefore racialized as being non-Black inherently because of speaking Spanish. And so the data that I've collected is from my master's thesis. I conducted fieldwork during the summer of 2018. I engaged in participant observation, a mixture of formal and informal interviews while I was in a Dominican hair salon in Atlanta, Georgia. And so typically the women in the salon, and it was majority women, could be classified into two different categories. The first being clients who were born in the United States. And when I asked them about their racial identity, they would either use terms like Black or African American, and they typically spoke English. Whereas the stylists were born in the Dominican Republic, but had immigrated to the Northeast United States, which has large ethnic enclaves of Dominicans, and then eventually migrated to Atlanta later in their adult lives. And so when I asked them about their racial identities, they typically use terms like Dominican or Dominicana or Hispana. And these women typically spoke Spanish, but they had a domain-specific understanding of English that they use typically in the salon to communicate specifically with their clients. And so my analysis is guided by the research question: what are the stakes and consequences of others evaluating our linguistic competence when we are not members of the groups to whom the language we speak is imagined to belong? So when we think about language as belonging to certain groups and not belonging to other groups, then the stakes and the consequences of speaking those languages change depending on evaluations of linguistic ability and linguistic competence. And so for the rest of my presentation, I'll go through sort of a line-by-line discourse analysis of a ratiolinguistic exception, which took the form of me, in which I am oftentimes evaluated as a very ambiguous looking person. People have a hard time placing my racial identity. And though I do not often enjoy these sorts of conversations, it became emergent in my data as I questioned other people's racial identities and questioned things that were kind of taken for granted in the context of the salon, trying to make them more explicit. People also asked me questions. And through that process, these sorts of etiologies mentioned beforehand of mestizaje and hypodescent became more explicit as well. And so there were, in the interaction that I'll show, this is a small excerpt. The context of it is that Lily was doing Diana's hair and she was performing a Dominican blowout. And for those of you familiar with the Dominican blowout, this is a very involved process that can take several hours. So this was a relationship, this was a conversation that is taken from hours of interaction. And it was a very casual conversation between the three of us that began in Spanish. But because of my linguistic limitations in Spanish, Diana quickly became frustrated with the direction of the conversation and switched into English. And in that switch into English, her friend Yasmine was able to join the conversation as a monolingual English speaker. And so the interaction begins with Yasmine entering the conversation and the conversation beginning in English. And so the conversation begins with this question of, what are you? And in this process, I've had this question asked to me 1,000 times before. So I know that what's being asked isn't what's my gender, isn't like, am I a student? It's asking about my racial identity. And so I say I'm Black very transparently. And so then there's just this little bit of an awkward exchange. And I use this as an opportunity to get more data. And I engage and ask, what did you think I was? And Diana introduces this category of some type of Spanish, right? And so in this process, in this interaction, we have two different racial categories being introduced. I introduce Black and Diana introduces some type of Spanish. And so what we see in Diana's introduction of some type of Spanish is that some type of Spanish does not necessarily include a Black identity and almost necessitates that these are mutually exclusive categories. And we can also understand that these are US racial categories, not necessarily Dominican racial categories, because again, we're in the context of Atlanta and the Dominican salon. And so some type of Spanish becomes racialized as a US category in opposition to Blackness. And through Diana's response, we see some type of Spanish to be representative of an ideology of mestizaje in which Black would not be its own racial category, but by me claiming a Black identity, it negated the possibility of me also being some type of Spanish in Diana's eyes. And so this does not offer space for me to be Black and some type of Spanish. This would be an either or. And then we can understand this use of the term Spanish as sort of what Bailey's explored in his work as being sort of like a in-group term to point to a pan-ethnic identity linked by the shared linguistic or the shared language rather. And so then when we shift into the next part of the interaction, we see that evaluations of my Spanish skills were dependent on my racial identity. So Diana says, your Spanish is very good then. So my Spanish is only good because I say I'm Black. What we see in line 10 is if I identified as some type of Spanish as she assumed I was, then my Spanish was bad Spanish. So what we see through this is that races are being held to different sorts of linguistic expectations. And what we're also seeing is how race and language co-constitute each other and how they inform each other through the process of racialization through ratiolinguistic etiologies. So the quality of my Spanish, according to Diana, would be less acceptable if I were, say, a heritage or a native speaker, which would be grouped under this terminology of some type of Spanish. And so, again, we can continue to understand this under an etiology of mestizaje in which it is presumed that the Spanish language belongs to a racialized group that does not include a Black identity. And so, to be explicit, the evaluations of my language skills depended on my racial identity, but also my language skills were used to locate my identity. And it's not just that these evaluations are happening by Deanna, but she also asked about my identity. And so this points to the sort of co-production of racial identity between myself and Deanna. And then we see how Lily enters the conversation, and she's talking about an interaction that she had with her sister, who's actually the owner of the salon, in which I wasn't present, in which they were trying to locate my identity as well. And we see in line 16, though she's asking about my specific identity, in line 17, she starts with an evaluation of my lineage. She starts with an evaluation of my father, right? And so what she is assuming in that interaction is that at the very least, I am one generation removed from, or I would be perhaps like a 1.5 or a second generation immigrant to the US. But I wouldn't necessarily myself be from the places that she suggests, such as Puerto Rico and Cuba. And also the fact that she suggests Puerto Rico or Cuba as opposed to the Dominican Republic is interesting in and of itself, because it points to these sorts of deeper racio-ethnic differences between countries in the Caribbean and the sorts of racialization that happens in these places. And so on several occasions, Lily had compared my Spanish-speaking abilities with those of her daughters, who were actually part of the 1.5 in the second generation in the US. And so through that process of comparison, she makes clear the expectations that she has for different racial groups, for different ethnic groups, as well as for different generations in the US. So we can see how racialization is dependent on multiple contexts and not just, as some people believe, just looking at someone and being able to place them rather quickly and easily. And so we see this interaction ending with Yasmine now entering the conversation and also introducing hypodescent as an etiology, where she asks, are you part Spanish? So in this asking of if I'm part Spanish, it allows for someone to be both Black and Spanish, right? And I also engage in an ideology of hypodescent when I say I'm fully Black. And at this point, I'm somewhat frustrated with the conversation, even though I invited it. And I'm trying to end the conversation by saying I'm fully Black. There's nothing else there. I know this could go on forever. And so we're both drawing on etiologies of hypodescent in this way. But in line 25, it really highlights how I am being evaluated as a racio-linguistic exception by asking, how do you know how to speak it, how to speak Spanish, right? So what we're seeing is that even though it allows for me to be both Black and Spanish, it doesn't necessarily allow for Black Spanish speakers because of the ideology that the Spanish language belongs to a racial category that is both non-Black and some type of Spanish. And so what we can see here is that through 25 lines, it's been established, challenged, and accepted that my racial identity is Black, which reflects how strong these ideologies really are. And so what we see through this are certain interruptions to mestizaje. One is that linguistic behaviors lead people to interpret others as a particular race, as sounding like a race. And I use Jonathan Rosas's terminology here of sounding like a race, in which again, linguistic behaviors are determining how people are racialized. And some consequences of relying solely on an ideology of mestizaje is that the Spanish language is believed to belong to native or heritage Spanish speakers, which requires the erasure, or at least a minimization of Blackness as a part of an identity. And what we see is that Black Spanish speakers do not fit into the ideological framework of mestizaje. So in conclusion, I'd like to point out that since Blackness was generally valued in the salon, as you as Black and Dominican women sought each other out in these spaces and worked collaboratively, such as with the Dominican Blowout, the co-production of racialization for me in the salon reflected a low-risk environment and resulted in only slight frustration on my part. However, this is not a universal privilege, as those who are both Black and Spanish speaking outside of the safety of the salon are racialized based on not only appearance, but linguistic performance. So there are consequences to erasure through racialization that span from misrepresentation on the census and therefore misappropriation of funds to recognition in public spaces as Black and therefore threatening or excuse me, or Spanish speaking and therefore threatening, which in both cases can and does result in things like criminalization, death, or both. And the need to recognize those who are Black and speak Spanish is important, so that while they may be may be more at risk for certain injustices, we can work to create more inclusive spaces by acknowledging the potential of being racialized as Black and Spanish speaking. So some of the main takeaways of my presentation are that racialization is based on more than appearance or self-identity. It's a collaborative process, and that ideologies surrounding race and language can impact racialization, and that race and language not only co-constitute each other, but that language can interrupt assumptions surrounding race and has the power to redirect the process of racialization. So I thank you all for your attention. And I want to give a quick shout out to my committee and various classmates who have helped me with several iterations of this manuscript. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amber. Our respondent for this session is a fellow Dominican and colleague, Yasmine Irisari, who earned her PhD in sociology with a certificate in college pedagogy at Indiana University, and currently serves as assistant professor here at the University of Texas at Austin, where she's duly appointed in sociology and African diaspora studies. Dr. Irizarry's research interests include the sociology of education, racial and ethnic identity, and sexuality and queer studies. Her previous research has been variously supported by the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the National Science Foundation to investigate issues related to inequality in elementary and high school contexts, the quantitative measurements of race, social attitudes, and prejudice and discrimination. I leave you with Yasmine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And thank you. I want to first just stop and have everybody applaud all the presenters. These were 3 wonderful presentations. And so if we could do that real quickly before I speak, because I'm honored to be here. It's a pleasure. I'm glad that Jackie asked me to be here. These were wonderful presentations, and I've got so many ideas, but I have 5 minutes, and I don't want to take much of this time speaking about my thoughts on this, because I would really like to get to the Q&A and hear more about the presentation. So there's just a couple things that I wanted to talk about that I noticed that were threads throughout the presentations that were really important. And some of these have already been stated in the presentations, but I want to bring them back up to both think about and connect the presentations and connect some of the ideas from the presentations. So one of the things I've really thought about with this idea of language and the use of language in different ways, the rhetorical strategies and what it accomplishes. So the use of language to present a particular version of the self. We see in Molly's presentation, the self being presented through who a person is using the language on the signs in the protests. In Aris's presentation, we see the self being presented through posts online and how people present themselves and who they are or who they believe themselves to be and want others to see them as. And we also see the same with Amber and the dialogue happening in the salon, where individuals are trying to figure out and then stating who they are, right? So presentations of the self, and also to communicate a particular version of the self within the context, right? So the self is important, but the self is being presented within and being shaped by that particular context. So who that self is may vary depending on where one is. So in that salon versus in an online presentation of self versus on the street in protest and written form. And so we see versions of the self being presented and the importance of the context and shaping who that self is. So that's one thing idea around presenting this, but also language to build community, right? So we see the use of language to build coalitions, to build alliances, to build an idea of who the community is, to structure who the community is, right? So whether the community is in Pueblo, whether the community is a particular community of Afro-Dominicanos online, whether it is a particular community or idea of community and who is part of the community of Spanish speakers or of being Spanish versus being Black, right? So we see this used to build an idea of the community, and also the use of language to draw boundaries right? So we see the use of language to draw boundaries in many different ways. The use of language to draw boundaries between el pueblo and governing elites, right? To say that this is the separation, I am part of this group and this is a different group. And the use to draw boundaries between groups who are Black online, whether they are Black, whether they are not Black. So we're seeing the use of boundaries between groups, but also boundaries between categories, right? So the who falls into what category, who can be Black, who is Spanish, when they are and when they aren't, and the use of different types of different language and rhetorical strategies to try to structure those ideas. So we see that use of language there. So for this boundary making, for both the community building and for the boundary making between groups and between categories. And all of these are shaped within that particular context, and that context is shaping who those groups are, who the communities are within that moment, and where the boundaries lie between groups. And then just the last thing that I wanted to say was, well, the third thing I want to say is this idea of shaping the view of the social context itself, right? So one is presenting a particular view of the self, a particular view of community, and a particular set of boundaries, but they're not just presenting it to themselves, right? Like they're not saying this to themselves in their homes. They're saying it to others. They're saying it to others they believe are part of that in-group community with them. They're saying it to individuals who they believe are part of those out-groups, outside of the group that they're building community with. And they're saying it to the public, because we're seeing, at least in two of these presentations, a specific rhetorical strategy being presented in public forums, either on signs to the public, out in public, and pictures of these signs being taken and these signs being put online, or in the use of videos or in posts around videos and comments using hashtags online as well, right? And so we see the use of language in the building of oneself and social identity, the building of community, the structuring of boundaries between groups and between categories, all to communicate to different others about the self, the community, and in essence, the social context. So the social context is shaping what people are saying, is shaping how these shaping these rhetorical strategies, but these rhetorical strategies, these words, these linguistic styles, these presentations are also then shaping a view of the context, trying to give you an idea of what the context is, what we believe the context should be. And the last thing I noticed I thought was really important was this idea of language to reshape or reaffirm ideology. So it's not about just shaping a particular context in that particular moment, but at times also shaping broader ideas about ideology and about the social systems. And so we see in all three presentations, words and comments that are reshaping ideas about ideological foundations, whether it be the person in the protest who brings the sign that says, we're not always community, and I'm not just building a boundary, but I'm also speaking about a particular ideology within our system, or whether it be the use of, or the denial of, or the reaffirming of, or the countering to particular racial logics that people use to try to identify and classify individuals, or identify and classify themselves. And so we see language in all these different ways, as the title of the presentation says, across all these geographic spaces, allowing individuals to communicate particular ideas of who they are, of how they see a particular context, and allowing others who are viewing them to gain particular ideas about these contexts and about these ideologies. So I'm just going to stop there because there's just so much. I'm ready for the Q&A to hear more from the presenters about their presentations. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yasmine, for your comments. I would also just like to end the session with an open discussion, inviting the panelists to respond to the respondent, but also just inviting the broader audience. You can pose your questions by unmuting yourselves or by posting in chat. So if any of you panelists would like to respond to Yasmine before we hear from the audience.
I did want to say one quick thing, Yasmine. Thank you so much for those comments. They were wonderful, and we are all thinking through these things as we do our work. One of the things that my work has developed into is this idea of trying to conceive of a Black American, a hemispheric Black American community of practice, and that these practices sometimes transcend the boundaries that are created by explicit pronouncements, right? And so even though we may have explicit pronouncements against categories, against identifications that are either placed upon us or that we have redefined in different ways, a lot of times these practices that parallel across groups, across this hemisphere kind of break, rompe con toda la idea. Like they just breaks the whole idea of a boundary that has been created by these ideologies. So I'm working on understanding the ways that people that speak different languages, that may have different varieties within those different languages, often engage in similar practices that parallel an experience of Blackness and of being subjugated peoples within the Americas, within the context of post-colonial or colonial formations. Right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Luana has a question.
Hello, thank you. First of all, Jackie Toribio, mil gracias. Thank you for accepting my invitation to participate. You know that, I always gush over how brilliant you are as a linguist. So I want to thank you publicly for accepting the invitation, and you are a rock star. That being said, I also want to thank the panelists for such wonderful presentations. And my question goes to Aris. Aris, I loved your presentation because it is very timely. And I loved how you are bringing to the forefront the conversation of these las delimitaciones de la Afro-Dominicanidad, right? So I guess my question is, why do you think, or rather, do you think that Dominican identities along racial lines are being defined through a lens of the United States, where culturally speaking, we have different forms of speech that are racialized. Even the way that we worship is racialized in the United States. Whereas in the Dominican Republic, if you're Dominican, you eat arroz, habichuela, carne, you dance merengue, bachata, dembow, you have the similar speech styles, except if you're from El Cibao, where I'm from, right? But why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult for Americans to understand that there is a unifying, so to speak, Dominican identity that gets, there's almost like a resistance of non-Dominicans, that you can be Dominican, right? And still have your racial identity, but it's not so discreet as it is in the United States because of the racial legacy of slavery in the United States that is so different from the Dominican Republic. I'm sorry, it's long-winded, but this is something that as a college professor, my students come to me, my Dominican students come to me asking these questions. So, and also my African-American friends, like the definition of Blackness within the context of the United States. So in your observations, why is it so difficult?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. This is a question that I obviously think through a lot in doing my work. I definitely think that Dominican identity, especially in the United States, is being defined through a lens, through a US lens of a racial lens. I also think that transnationalism, both in digital spaces as well as within the population of Dominicans in the United States and the Dominican Republic historically and right now, is creating this situation where there is like this double notion of race where hypodescent sits on top of mestizaje. And so that's also creating. I also think that, especially in terms of African Americans, there has been an active education or miseducation, if you will, an active miseducation of the differences between racial structures across the hemisphere on purpose, right? Because as this is a colonial structure, in order to maintain the hierarchy that exists in the United States. So African Americans have been miseducated about the sheer numbers of African descendants south of the United States, right? So that 10 times the number of Africans were brought south to the United States, that is never talked about in school. It's never something that's even talked about in families. It's not something that people are aware of, right? And so there's an active miseducation happening on both sides. And this there is what's happening in Latin America, which is this idea, the ideology of racial democracy, being that because we have these shared practices like todos comemos arroz con habichuela y hablamos casi igual, that there is no anti-Blackness, right? We have this racial democracy. So then that is also pushing against these ideas of, well, since everybody with one drop of African blood is Black, then we have clear and concise definitions of anti-Blackness in the United States, right? So all of these things are interacting and playing on top of each other, and they're creating these conflicts and understandings between what could be a community and what are the actual boundaries, right, between practices. And that's what I have to say for now, but I can talk about this more.
Thank you so much, Aris. I'm going to read a question that's in the chat, and then we'll allow Aldrin to ask a question. The question in the chat is for Amber about the Dominican hair salons. Does having similar hair types bring any type of solidarity, or is there a sense of differentiation in their interactions with each other?
Thank you so much for this question. I think something that I would have liked to go into more detail about because of time limitations, didn't get the chance to, was that the owner of the salon actually chose the location in Atlanta of, like, it was a historically Black neighborhood in Atlanta, and Atlanta is already a majority Black city, because she specifically wanted Black clientele, because she saw a need in the Black community and a want for the Dominican blowout. And so I would say that hair was a place where people were able to work collaboratively, though there were certain differences that existed. Something that I was really interested in and I explore more in my thesis are the ways in which people were able to communicate when language wasn't enough, right? So when the domain-specific English of the stylist and the monolingual English abilities of the clients didn't necessarily match up, they relied on things like gesture, they relied on things like habitual attendance in the salon to understand and to navigate certain spaces. And so I would say that if I hadn't brought up these axes of difference in terms of race, that they maybe wouldn't have been so pronounced. So me being in the salon definitely, I think, changed the context and the ways that certain people interacted with each other. But overall, I would say that through the relationships and through certain interactions, I remember the owner of the salon, when I would bring up some of these differences, she would say, somos la raza, like, and would kind of like homogenize the groups of women in the salon and try to think about the similarities more than the differences. So through my analysis, I highlight how some of these things were emergent in my data collection. But yeah, I think much more collaborative and happy to share spaces with each other, and saw similarity before difference. Yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Aldrin, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. My question. Hi. Thank you for the presentations. They were amazing. My question is with the usage now of Ancestry.com and like DNA info and 21andMe, like like how much is that being used in the Dominican Republic, right? And does that help? Because I know in the U.S. many people are like, holy crap, like I'm 22% Angolan and 13% Senegalese and 3% like indigenous, and then so regardless of what you think, right, up until the point where you receive that information, now it's telling you, right, like what, like by percent and all that. So to what extent do you think that'll change the discourse? That'll change folks' desire to learn, more specifically even about the areas in which they hail from, and in the Iberian coast as well?
I would love to take this question. So in those videos that I analyzed, there's a whole set and that I did not analyze on purpose of Dominicans just reading out their DNA ancestry, right? It's like a genre of YouTube videos. So I'm reading out my DNA ancestry and not only from 23andMe, it'll be like 23andMe, ancestry.com. They'll do like 3 or 4 of different types within it. So people are really thinking about this DNA. I do have to say, as social scientists, we had come to this point where we were like, genetic race is not real. And then DNA scientists came out and they were like, there's this whole DNA thing. And the DNA thing is creating a resurgence of genetic ideologies of race that aren't necessarily corroborated by biology, right? And so this idea that people want to hold on to, like, what particularly am I, especially without having the genetic background to understand exactly how the DNA tools are being used, is just creating a reification of these kind of scientific ideologies of race that create boundaries, that very purposeful boundaries that reify hierarchies, right? Social hierarchies. And so people are really engaged in this process. But if we think about it, these DNA tests are about, what, 20, 30 years old? And so all of the work that was done over the last 100 years in anthropology and sociology to break down the ideologies of genetic race are being broken down in 20 years by some genetic tests that are telling you that possibly you have something in common with some people we tested in this region of the world. Right.
I'm afraid that our time has ended. I would like to encourage you all to participate in the conference welcome that will start in about 10 minutes now. And thank you all for participating in our session. I hope that we're able to continue this discussion in another forum sometime soon. Thank you all to the panelists and to our respondents. And again, thank you to the audience.